Alireza Firouzja loves to attack, even if it means weakening his own king, and we saw that in this game played against Evgeny Postny in round 7 of the World Blitz 2021. So I'm taking a look back at some of Alireza's best games played in this tournament, and this is one of them. We have this Spanish on the board, Firouzja's playing white here, and we have these standard opening moves being trotted out now, with rook to e1, pawn to b5 and bishop dropping back into b3. And now black goes pawn to d6 here. More common is to see black castling, and you leave options open of playing an immediate d5, which is the Marshall gambit, should white go c3. But we didn't see that in this game. Instead, black goes with the immediate d6. Now we had pawn to c3 from Firouzja, and knight to a5, an unusual way to play. Normally black will castle immediately, but instead black tries to play in a very aggressive and dominant way here, putting that knight on the edge, kicking back the bishop, and then going pawn to c5. So Firouzja immediately strikes in the centre as well. He plays pawn to d4, good move. And now we had queen c7 from black, a very standard square for the queen to sit on in these structures. You could take first and then play queen c7, but either way you would never want to take twice here in the middle, because after knight d4 you've got this horrible pawn on d6. White has a nice initiative. So that's why we had queen c7 here, just maintaining the tension, asking Firouzja how he wants to play. And now Firouzja develops a piece with knight b to d2. Good move, developing the pieces. You don't want to chop here and open the d file, because black's just going to be a bit quicker to the punch, say with bishop e6, rook to the d file. These pieces are still a bit stuck at home here, and it's a bit of a problem for white if white isn't careful. So that's why we had development from Firouzja, and now we had c takes on d4, pawn recaptures and bishop to g4. So nice development from black. They're getting all of their bits out here. This one's now pressuring the knight, which is defending d4, and so Firouzja has to think about that threat. He first plays pawn to h3, the bishop drops back, maintaining the pressure, and that's why Firouzja now goes pawn to d5, just to take away this central pressure. And although he now closes the position and gives this c5 square to black, he has gained some space for the long term, which is going to play to his advantage if he can use it in an attack. So now we had knight to b7, immediately trying to take advantage of the weakness of the last move. And here we go from Firouzja. He loves to attack, pawn to g4. And the bishop now drops back into g6. Just coming back one move, you can play with knight f1 here. The computer prefers this kind of play. You don't weaken the king. You still have ideas of knight to g3. But as said, Firouzja just loves to attack. This is so his style, especially in blitz chess. And once he's kicked this bishop back, he's trying to keep it shut out of the game with these pawns on the light squares. But it's a double-edged move, because black can look to play h5 in future and start undermining these pawns. So we had knight to f1 now after black drops the bishop back. Rook to c8 here, attacking this bishop. And so black is first to this open line, and white needs to deal with that pressure. And rook to e2 was played. A nice move, just defending that bishop, still holding on to this e4 pawn, and in future we might see this rook able to swing across and double on the file without loss of tempo. And this is a really important point to actually pause for a moment and take stock of the position, because black plays a positional mistake here by going knight to d7. And the reason this is a positional mistake can be demonstrated through the variation that black should have played, which is castles. And the reason castles is such a superior move is that one, you improve the rook, which is stuck in the corner, so you bring your worst piece into play. You also get the king to safety. And two, the knight, which is on f6, is actually left there because it's doing a good job on that square of pressuring this e4 pawn, which is quite key in some variations. If we now play through the moves which went in the game, but in this line, so knight to g3, pawn to a5, bishop to e3, queen to d8, and pawn to a3. These are all the moves that we saw in the game, but now here's the difference. White is threatening to go pawn to b4 here, but black can now go in with the immediate knight to c5, pressuring this e4 pawn 3 times because all 3 of these pieces are attacking it. And so you don't have time to play pawn to b4, or now the knight can actually just pick up that pawn there. So this is the key difference between castling instead of moving this knight away. But if we run back here as to what happened in the game, instead of castles we had knight to d7, and now we'll see this exact same variation. So knight to g3, pawn to a5, bishop to e3, queen to d8, pawn to a3, and now we had castles. Because if in this position knight c5 was played, well, this isn't working because pawn to b4 comes, and you can't take on e4 because you're just losing a piece there. So that's why we had castles, but now Firouzja gets this big positional bind with pawn to b4. He's taken away the c5 square, which is critical, and also he's fixed this b5 pawn as a weakness. Really instructive play here from Firouzja. So knight to b6 now from black. So this knight's gone like this and it's looking to come into c4, but it just wasn't the right plan, unfortunately, for black. And now we had bishop to d3. Good move. Immediately eyeing this fixed weakness, and that's why black goes knight to c4 to protect there. But the problem now for black is that white can simply take, and after the rook recaptures, white is actually winning the c-file with this great move, rook to c1. And black actually took here, white took here, and we had this variation. But just running it back a few moves, even if black had tried to hold the c-file with, say, queen to c7, well, now you can just take. And if the queen recaptures, then we're coming across with the other rook. And that's the beauty of this lift, which we saw earlier on. It's just not possible for black to hold the file here. If they take on c1, we recapture with the queen. If you challenge the file like this, we have rook c2. So this is why it's just so good now for white. Black went in for this variation and then played the queen onto a8, activating it onto the a file. But the problem now is this pawn on c4. Queen c1 is a great move, attacking it. We had rook c8, rook c2, queen a6, but now knight d2 comes, and there's just too many attackers on this pawn. This is the big problem for black. So bishop to h4 here, trying to get some counterplay, but Friouzja now just stamps that out with knight into f5. Good move, stepping away from this tactic, and after the bishop captured here, which is kind of forced, the pawn recaptured, and now this one really is going to be dropping in a moment. Black tried pawn to g6. You can take here, but actually Firouzja just goes in for this one. He takes on c4. We had this series of exchanges, and now the queen came down to give a check. King g2, queen d1, desperately trying to generate some play along these squares. And now knight f3, good move, attacking this loose bishop and cutting out the queen here. Now we had bishop to f6, queen to c8 check. The knight comes back to d8, defended by the bishop. But now bishop to g5, and the bishop is just overloaded because after it takes here, the knight recaptures. This one is dropping off now because it's pinned to the king. We had king g7, the queen captured here, queen to d2 attacking the knight. But now a really nice finish from Firouzja. If you want to pause and look for it, please do so. Pawn to f6 here. The king moved away, knight takes check, king h5 only move, and queen d7, setting up this threat of checkmate here. And if you play something like queen f4 to stop that, well, then we can just swap the queens anyway, go in for this, and one of these two pawns will decide the game. If you enjoyed this video, then do hit here to subscribe, and see another amazing epic chess game, click here. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon.